Today's game is quite unusual. In fact, I'd say it's probably the most obscure build engine game that there is. Shaw's Nightmare was made by Michael Muniko back in 2013. From what I've read, back when he was a teenager. A quite young one at that as well. The game is very clearly inspired by Doom, with some very similar weapons and game design elements in some of the levels. Although by now it's pretty obvious that there are some significant flaws with this game. The first thing to strike me was the sound effects. The distinct sound of yowling cats was quite grating on my nerves, but most of the other sound effects are actually quite reasonable, although the volume amongst them isn't always consistent. The music is very simplistic, but actually really kind of adds to the surreal atmosphere generated by the artwork for the game. It's pretty clear that most of the artwork was done with something like MS Paint, and most of it is fairly simplistic, but in a way it kind of has its own charm. But it doesn't come without some flaws. The most obvious one to me is that a lot of the sprites are way too large. They end up clipping into the nearby walls when any of the creatures get too close. Another flaw is that the corpses for the enemies can often be quite large and obscure your view. If there has been a significant battle and a number of enemies have died, it's often difficult to see where the remaining enemies are, so you can't really shoot them. This applies mostly to a grey enemy that makes a cat yowling sound, and also a yellow Pac-Man thing with legs that also makes a cat yowling sound. Other than those, most of the enemies are actually pretty reasonable. The game actually makes some pretty good use of some of the features in the build engine. You may have noticed already that most objects that you can pick up are actually voxel objects. That is, they are 3D objects made out of voxels instead of a flat textured sprite. There are also some other features of the build engine at play here as well, such as sloping floors, a variety of different doors, and rooms that can exist over other rooms. I even found some mirrors where you can see Shaw in all of his badly drawn glory. I mentioned earlier that all of the weapons are inspired by those from Doom, and your starting weapon is a small catapult which throws stones, which is basically the equivalent of a pistol. Pretty soon you'll get something called a Dober wand, which is this weird looking thing with two little red antennas, and that is roughly the equivalent of a shotgun. Eventually you'll pick up a rapid fire catapult, which is kind of like a chain gun, a hand grenade thrower, which is a rocket launcher, and a camera gun, which shoots little flashes that sort of move across the screen, little projectiles, and that's roughly the equivalent of a plasma gun. Eventually you'll find all of the weapons, and they're all pretty much like their counterparts in Doom, and for the most part they actually work quite well. One difference here is that the build engine allows you to aim up and down. There is no effective auto aim here, so when you encounter an enemy that is higher or lower than you, you will need to aim up or down to shoot at it. The weapon sprites don't help with this because they don't make it clear exactly where your aiming point is, and some of them are quite large, so they take up a lot of the screen area, making it harder to aim. In general, it's workable, it's just that it could be better. For the most part, I think the flaws so far have been mostly very forgivable. You can work around most of these problems and still have quite a lot of fun. Unfortunately, all of this is kind of spoiled a little bit by the controls, which don't work as well as I would like. It's really kind of hard to describe how they feel. It's kind of like moving around in treacle. It feels slow and unresponsive. I tried it with the keyboard and mouse, and I found the mouse control was just not sensitive enough, even at the maximum sensitivity. It's really difficult to describe how the mouse controls are, but let's just say that you can't really aim with any precision easily. So I ended up going back to just keyboard controls. The default controls didn't really work well for me, so I defined my own, which was a plus. But there were a few keys that I would have liked to be able to have, such as using the Alt key to toggle between strafe and turn, much like in Doom. That would have been helpful, but it wasn't present here. I could have made more use of the Run key, which also increases the speed at which you turn, but I hadn't figured that part out yet. So far I've talked a lot about the flaws in Shaw's Nightmare, but there are some things that are actually done quite well. For instance, I think the level design is done quite well. The enemy placement is pretty good. I could figure out all of the puzzles reasonably, and there wasn't any annoying platform sections that some games have. The enemy placement in particular is quite important, as the enemies are pretty much brain-dead zombies. I understand that it's difficult to code a decent AI, so it's good that he's made up for it here with decent placement. I generally found that it was a good idea to explore a lot of the levels. There are a lot of little secret nooks and crannies where you'll find extra weapons and ammunition. I certainly didn't have any trouble finding enough ammunition for my playthrough, but I was playing on one of the lower difficulty levels. You'll certainly need more ammunition if you play on one of the harder modes, which increases the number of enemies significantly. Speaking of ammunition, I think the weapons are actually really well balanced. While there are flaws with the sprites, all of the weapons are useful for one task or another. Although once you get the heavier weapons, the abundance of ammunition means you don't need to switch back to something weaker to conserve ammunition. Although again, this could have been because of the low difficulty level I was playing on. Before I wrap up, I'd just like to say I actually think that Shaw's Nightmare is quite impressive, despite its flaws. I did eventually grapple with the poor controls and was able to play it for a couple of hours and was quite entertained. The other thing that really impressed me here was the sheer amount of content in this game. It would have taken quite a lot of effort to produce all of this. There are 5 episodes of 9 levels each, and I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's actually quite a lot of effort for one person to do, especially when they're also doing graphics, sound, and programming it. And whilst there are some significant flaws, you can tell that a lot of effort and passion was put into this project. There are 2 versions of the game available for download. The one I've captured most of my footage here with is actually the Windows version of Shaw's Nightmare, which will run natively under Windows 10 that I've got on my PC. The downside of the Windows version is that the graphics acceleration tends to blur the image a little bit, which is particularly noticeable on the hard edges on the textures on walls. Of course, the game was originally made for DOS, and you can play it under DOSBox using maximum cycles and more than 24 megabytes of memory configured for DOS. I found the higher cycle count made the controls work slightly better under the DOS version, and you might find DOSBox's key mapper to be a good way to handle the controls. I didn't try this, but I think it's something I probably should have tried. Something I did try was running Shaw's Nightmare on some real hardware. The computer in question is a Pentium 200 with an S3 graphics card. As usual, my recording device does not capture the CRT very well, but in general, it does actually play quite well on this machine. I don't have any speakers connected to this machine at the moment, so all we have for sound is PC speaker. I don't know if it was my imagination, or if I was just getting better at using the controls, but the game actually feels like it plays better on real hardware. Don't get me wrong, it's not perfect, just incrementally better. If you're interested in trying Shaw's Nightmare out, I will put a link to the itch.io page for it in the description below. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.